come here to listen to an obscure Finnish international lawyer to talk about his project, which is a wonderful privilege. For the first time in Belgrade, I enjoyed walking the city this morning. How warm it was, quite a contrast to where I come from. Indeed, the fact that I can talk about what it is that I'm now doing and a certain concern I have is at least very useful for me, but I hope it also is of some use to you. As Professor Giorgio said, I am presently writing a history of the legal imagination as applied to what is called the international world. And in that, so far 6-year project, I've encountered the fact that, of course, it's very unsurprising that the history of international law, as well as the historiography of the field, is very Eurocentric. And I'm a European person, known in the profession as a crit, a kind of a left-wing critic of the profession, and therefore it's quite natural of me to be worried about why is it that I keep talking of these old dead white maids from Europe, most of whom were engaged in various imperialist ventures outside Europe when they developed international law. And this lecture is a series of reflections on that predicament. When one starts to write on the history of international law, or indeed think about international law in general, then Westphalia, the Peace of Westphalia, is the first thing one encounters, 1648. And here you see Münster and Osnabrück, two European facades, two European commercial centers in North Rhine-Westphalia, the northern parts of Germany, very familiar European environments, the connotations of the marketplace, of the commercial buildings behind. We know all of that, and in some sense the history I am writing is the history of those things that happened in those places. 1648, people say, is the starting point of the international order, sovereignty, the sovereign state was culminating, the starting point of modern diplomacy, the diplomacy of sovereign states, etc. Of course, there were other locations, other European locations afterwards. Utrecht, the Peace of Utrecht, 1713, where the idea of balance of power was written into the treaties. The Peace of Vienna, 1815, the Congress after the Napoleonic Wars, Hague, Paris, Geneva. All of these familiar European locations at which European men met each other to what they thought was to rule the world, and in that context thought that the legal vocabulary, legal words, would be helpful in their project of ruling the world. Now, when one then engages with the literature of history of international law, the historiography of the field, then of course one cannot avoid notions such as Roman law. There's Cicero speaking to the Roman Senate. Ideas such as jus gentium, and indeed the word jus gentium is a complex set of associations that emerge with Roman law. The juxtaposition of civil law, jus civile and jus gentium, the law of nations, is very familiar. And when intellectuals, mostly theologians, in the 16th century for the first time started to employ the vocabulary of jus gentium to think about what their princes were doing, mainly outside Europe, they were making more or less hidden reference to the Roman Senate. One can't write about international law without mentioning the Renaissance. So the images of the 16th century from Spain, from Italy, from Germany, from France, and from England. These familiar Renaissance images which have to do with the claim of sovereign rulers to rule over a determined territory and to establish relations with other rulers on territorial basis, issues of jurisdiction. All of this is about what the European Renaissance was like. The Napoleonic Wars, these men in tight trousers. Again, a series of European associations. Napoleon, whoever heard of Napoleon if you were an Indian or a Chinese person? For us Europeans, the Napoleonic Wars was a highly significant moment in which the so-called international order developed in a very specific way. And then more technical rules, such as the cannon shot rules, the cannon, the technical delimitation of the territorial sea, which was based on what European cannons at the beginning of the 17th century, how they could operate. All of this, the technology, the cultural associations, everything is a thoroughly European story. It's also a very specific European story. It's a Belgian story. So in a previous book mentioned here, The Gentle Civilizer of Nations, that I published about 10 years ago, I made the point that international law began on the 8th of September 1873 after lunch. With this I meant that on the 8th of September 1873, a group of 15 men met in Belgium, Ghent, you know, the small town of Ghent in Belgium, and they established the Institut de Droit International, the Institute of International Law, and on the 8th of September, after lunch, they adopted a statute, a kind of a constitution of the Institute of International Law. And in that statute, they said that the Institute will be the juridical conscience of the civilized world. What a wonderful feeling it can be to feel you are the civilized conscience, or the juridical conscience of the civilized world. But that was the first moment. The first moment when a group of men, of course, we thought this is a male history. A group of men looked at each other and recognized that we are international lawyers. There hadn't been such a moment previously. There were some chairs at European universities that were devoted to natural law, or jus naturae et gentium. There had been specialists of maritime law, of transport law, of the laws of war, but a profession in the specific sense that it then came to develop in the early 20th century was set up in 1873. And these three men are part of the story. They are also part of the story of the historiography of the field, the histories of the field. I have to say, so I know I speak fast, but this is, I think, do you get it? Yeah. Okay, good. So, the first histories were written, when the first histories were written, these three men are important. François Laurent, 1810, 1887, who's he? Well, when I started to write the intellectual history of the application of the legal metaphor in international matters, then I came across an 18-volume Histoire des droits des gens, History of the Law of Nations. 18 volumes, which was written between 1855 and 1870. And I, of course, was very interested because it seemed, well, do I have to write 18 volumes too? Or maybe 36 volumes, because it's already some years ago. So, what? I just told you a second ago that international law was born in 1873. So how was it possible in the 1850s to write a Histoire des droits des gens, a history of the law of nations. And so I picked up the University Library in Helsinki. It's wonderful. It's wonderful because when Finland became a part of Russia, 1809, as you all remember immediately, then the Tsar donated a part of his library, of the Russian Emperor's library, to Helsinki. So we have a wonderful 18th, early 19th century library. And that's why Francois, the 18 volumes were there. So I looked at what was there in the first volume. The first volume contained familiar stories from the Assyrians and the Babylonians. The second volume goes to the Egyptians. Third volume, the Athenians, well, Greece, ancient Greece, Rome, etc. The fourth volume starts with a new preface, where Francois reports that his friends and colleagues had been contacting him saying, Francois, what you're writing is not a Histoire des droits des gens. It's not a history of the law of nations, it's a history of humanity. From that fourth volume onwards, the remaining 14 have two title pages. The content remains the same. You know the history, Assyrians, Babylonians, Egyptians, we all know this. And then you go to Renaissance, well, Middle Ages, Renaissance, early modernity, etc. So we all know this. So from the fourth volume onwards, Francois writes, on the one hand, history of the law of nations, on the other hand, history of humanity. They are the same thing in this particular imagination. So the historiography of the field, right, the ideology of the field too, thinks of itself as the history of humankind. That the law is humankind, and the other way around. So when we lawyers talk about our little things, actually we are talking about the things of humanity. So that's a very familiar legal set of associations. But Francois was not really a professional historian. The first professional of the new field, established in 1873, is his student, Ernst Nis, who was a professor of international law, this new discipline, at the University of Brussels, and then later on professor of legal history. And he started to write real professional histories with such names as the Law of Nations and the Papacy, the England and the Law of Nations, the Spanish scholastics and the Law of Nations, those kinds of things. In 1904, he wrote a treatise called Les origines du droit international, the origins of international law, and he found those origins in three notions. So the book is divided or organized through three concepts: progress, freedom, and humanity. So what did this mean by progress, freedom, and humanity? Progress meant everybody more or less becoming like they are in Brussels. And does that sound familiar? So progress is for everyone to be European in this specific Brussels-centered understanding. We are humanity. Freedom meant freedom from the Catholic Church. So international law is a Protestant discipline. I'm sorry. International law is a Protestant discipline. And humanity is the whole world once coming together, celebrating on the one hand what exists as a cultural center in Brussels in the name of Protestantism. So that's where the discipline's own history of itself starts and peaks. And I cannot leave my Belgian quasi-heroes without mentioning Baron Edouard Descamps, who became one of the better known members of the new profession in the early 20th century. I want to mention two facts about this man, which I hope illustrate the nature of the profession. On the one hand, most international law professors, such as myself, know him as a member of the Comité de Juristes, the committee of jurists set up by the League of Nations to draft the statute of the Permanent Court of International Justice, the predecessor of today's International Court of Justice in The Hague. In that process, and the procès-verbal are out there, you can check this, Edouard Leconte was the person who proposed that among the sources that the court should apply should also be general principles of law recognized by civilized nations. So that well-known professional international law expression, general principles of law recognized by civilized nations, comes from this tradition. And not only from this tradition, but from this man. What did this man think were general principles of law recognized by civilized nations? We don't know. But what we do know is that as the campaign against King Leopold's rule in the Congo started, Baron Leconte wrote an 800-page tract called Le Congo Belge, the Belgian Congo, defending his king, the king of the Belgians, Leopold II, against the malevolent accusations of British interests, Manchester's commercial interests, as if the king would have done anything but a humanitarian mission in the Congo. One big thing that is deeply embedded in the history of international law, or in the ideological world of the men who represent the application of legal imagination in international affairs, is a teleological imagination. So they are all thinking in providential terms that the future will be better. But it's a very specific kind of a teleology. So people like Hugo Grotius, you may have heard of him, kind of a predecessor of the men of 1873, constantly were criticizing the Spaniards for what they had done in the Indies. Images like this, terrible images of the Spaniards killing the Indians, when the conquistadors arrived in the Indies in the late 15th century, early 16th century, they set up a rule of terror. Through disease and war, they were destroying the Indian communities. Some people say that international law caused this, and I am sympathetic to that proposition, but the proposition is wrong, at least in the sense that international law was in part born from the criticisms by the Spaniards, but especially by the Protestants, of the Spanish actions. The Legenda Negra, the Black Legend, as it became known, was part of the imagination of the Protestant intellectuals such as Hugo Grotius and Immanuel Kant, who played such a big role in the application, as I call it, obscure application of legal metaphors, legal concepts in the international world. For Hugo Grotius, international law will lead us from those awful things, the Black Legend, into a commercial future. Hugo was not only a distinguished publisher of legal tracts, but also, as is very well known, legal counsel for the Vereinigte Ostindische Company, the Dutch East India Company, which was a rival to the Spaniards in the Indies. And in the De Jure Credi, his youthful work from 1606, and in De Jure Belli Pacis from 1625, on the laws of war and peace, he often mentions how fortunate it is that law can bring people together by organizing commercial transactions between people living far away from each other and lacking precisely the kinds of things which people are having in other places. Isn't it wonderful that the English can go to France to buy wine from there, whereas the Frenchman can buy linen from Britain? This is God's providence, God's secret plan to bring us together through commerce organized by trade. Immanuel, writing away in Königsberg once upon a time, thought in a similar way. He thought something that he called unsocial sociability, experience that we have of wars and destruction and evil, will slowly teach us that law is what we should have to keep our societies together and to bring us the good life in a constitutional republican world that we all so much desire. And the end point will be a round table somewhere in New York where humanitarian intervention will be decided. Anyway, so this teleology, this idea that history isn't just some story, but that it's embedded with a ready-made narrative that will bring us from here to there, is very crucial. International lawyers are optimists. Even at the worst of times, they believe that one day justice will come and it will be brought to us through the application of constitutional thinking, contractual thinking, institutional thinking, legal thinking. There are two kinds of histories. Now I go to when I started my writing of the history, I of course had to find out what is, apart from François Laurent and Ernst Nies and those people, more modern stuff. And sure enough, there was more modern stuff. There are those histories which can be called realist histories. Realist histories. And here are two chaps who are writers of realist histories. The single most widely used history of international law today, it's most widely used because it's now translated into English, is Wilhelm Greder's The Epochs of International Law. The original version, Epochen des Völkerrechts, published originally in Germany in the 1980s, but translated to English by a Canadian jurist, Michael Byers, in the year 2000. Epochen des Völkerrechts, the epochs of international law. Now, what kind of a story does he tell, this Greder person? So, for him, history of international law is the succession of solid epochs following each other, so that they started with the Spanish epoch, then there was a French epoch, then there was a little bit of a Dutch epoch, then there was an English epoch, and the 20th century, which he calls, amazingly, the Anglo-American condominium epoch. So, and what is an epoch? An epoch is a large brick of power, if you wish. An epoch is where a central power controls the whole system around it. So the Spanish epoch is the moment when Spain is in control, followed up by a French epoch in which the French are more or less in control, followed by an English, etc. So this is the idea of law. Law as a reflection of power, and therefore legal history as a series of reflections on reflection of power, or a succession of large bumps in which a central power dominates everything else. There's another person, and especially military power. who can send in the police are the ones who are in control. There's the other German chap whose name I promised I'd never mention, so I will not just mention that, but he also wrote a famous international legal history, which became famous after it was translated into English. The Novus of the World, or Jus Publicum Europaeum. Actually, that work was written already during the Second World War, as was Greve's original Epoch as well. They both manifest this idea that law is many different things. But above all, it is a reflection of power. That law always concentrates around a center of power. That to understand law, we must understand what lies underneath, beneath, or maybe inside it as the irreducible center that controls stuff. So, I found these kinds of histories. They are very, I have to say, I used to be, in my former life, I was a diplomat. And I have to say, many diplomats think like this. Diplomats think that the core of the international world is the Security Council. Or, let's say, the one who has the button to send in the nuclear weapons. That's the core of it. And that lawyers are nice things to have on the margins of diplomacy. They can deal with small things over there. Whereas inside it's hard like a stone. Well, it's interesting and it's familiar. Many people, it's a very journalistic view. Many light-thinking people often criticize international law just being a surface for power. Unfortunately, it's a silly thing. This kind of realism throughout the 20th century has been torn into pieces in a million different ways. It's silly, first of all, because there never was any such central power. There never was a clear, self-identical power center inside the legal world. If one looks at the Spanish Empire, as I've done in a series of articles I've published recently, if one looks at France, for instance, but also England, one finds that the imperial center is always already divided against itself. So the imperialists never know what to do, and they struggle with each other. One part of them wants to expand the empire, the other part of it wants to intensify empire. Some want to get rid of empire altogether because it actually costs too much for the state to bring it. So the point is that history isn't in the succession of homogeneous blocks. History is always already divided inside itself. The imperial center is nowhere. If you look at Valladolid, if you look at Paris during the 17th century, or indeed England in the 18th century, you find that the elites and the professionals were completely divided as to what to do. And they each had their different idea of what the role of law and legal institutions should be. Also, once the empire, so-called, is established, they always find that the imperial periphery goes its own way. So, once the Spaniards established their provinces in New Spain, in the Indies, the governors immediately started to conduct their own policy. And very often that policy meant cutting the ties to the metropolis. The same with the English, of course, the United States being the best example. At the height of England's imperial power, all of a sudden, the United States becomes independent. The point also, among many other points, is that empire is a legal construction. That you can't be, that it's not the case that there's first some power out there which creates an imperial law. For the empire to think of itself as empire, or for an imperialist to think of himself or herself as having a project, must already have internalized a number of legal rules about sovereignty and jurisdiction, and especially dominion, this Latin word that was so central when Charles V, for example, in the 16th century, tried to reconcile what sort of rule he as a Habsburg ruler had in the Habsburg Netherlands on the one hand, in Spain on the other hand, and in the Indies further on. And in order to understand what he was and what he represented, he had recourse to legal advisors who happened to be, of course, theological advisors and confessors at the time, people such as Francisco de Vitoria, Domingo de Soto, etc. Again, the point only, the mundane point being that law is not determined by power, that power constitutes itself by reference to many things, including law. So I don't want to write that kind of history. But there was always another kind of history as well. And if the first kind of history was typically written in German, this kind of history is typically written in French. And if you draw some conclusions, they may be yours. So there's a wonderful book on the history of international law written in 1923 by the Alsatian Jew professor, a professor from Alsace, from Strasbourg, Robert Retzler, a public law person. The book is called Les Grands Principes du Droit International. And it's a history of international law. It looks at the history of international law through 4 principles and sees the succession of events in the past as a slow unfolding or implementation of these 4 principles. What are those principles? They are the freedom of the state, the binding force of contracts, solidarity, and equality. Well, hold on. Who in their best minds can think that those 4 principles characterize the past of the world? Well, the French can. And of course, it is true that vocabularies about statehood and the freedom of the state, as he says, well, sovereignty, etc., is that you can't understand the history without such a word. Also, equality that follows from sovereignty, very important. Binding force of contracts. Of course, you can't, no realist can, every realist, if you put it this way, will starve to death without making contracts every now and then. That is to say, believing that contracts are binding and buying food. So of course, there you need that sort of thing as well. But surely that can't be all of it. So it's a perfectly idealistic view, in contrast to the view where the only thing that counts is who's got the nuclear weapons. This is the contrasting view, that who has the most beautiful principle. I put there another book that I came across while I was strolling around in Paris. One of these things that international lawyers are able to do is to stroll around in Paris. And then at the Rue du Soufflot, I came up with this book by Agnes Leibowitz, whom I don't know who she is. I've never met her. I don't know who she is. She's a philosopher, I'm sure. And she wrote Philosophie de droit international, the philosophy of international law. And this too told the story. It was a historical narrative of international law. This time, a narrative told in terms of dead white men who were prone to speaking abstractly about the world. So again, we meet people like Cicero, we meet people like Aristotle, people like Thomas Aquinas, Hugo Grotius, Emmanuel Martel, Immanuel Kant plays a big role, etc. And it's wonderful to read about those dead old men, but surely other things happened, apart from the fact that they lived and died and wrote or spoke as well. Again, the idea that the history of international law is a history of thinking. And then, of course, in both of these books, this kind of imagery plays a big role, idealist imagery of the specifically Francophone type. So I didn't want to do either one or the other. So what can one do? Okay, so now let's look at other stuff that's been out there. In the 1960s, after decolonization, intellectuals from the Third World started to appear in the UN, for instance, in various UN institutions. Some of them were broadly educated and started to write books about the past of the international. Here are two men, R.P. Anand, an Indian international lawyer, both a diplomat, or somebody who carried out diplomatic assignments, and writer of histories of international law in East Asia, in India, before the coming of the Europeans. Anand's work was to tell the stories of the empires and the nations that lived in the Indian peninsula, and then in the East Indies, the Moluccans and the others, their trade contacts with Japan and China in the 12th, 13th, 14th century, before the Europeans had set sail. The relations, the treaty relations, the public law relations, if you wish, between the communities before the Europeans, how dense they had been, how many-sided, and how interesting. So Anand was making those points. At the same time, Taslim O. Elias, a Nigerian lawyer, Elias became a Nigerian judge in the International Court of Justice, also very well known in various UN bodies. And he wrote similar kinds of books on the African empires, on the Sahrawi realm, on the Sudanese empire, the various parts of it, way before the Europeans had ever set foot in Africa. And it was clear that these histories were programmatically meant to undermine and to attack the Eurocentric histories that had existed before. These histories, however, had a big problem. What's the problem? The problem was that what they were saying was in effect this, that we too had sovereignty, that we too had diplomatic immunities, that we too were Europeans at the time, even before the Europeans. We are better Europeans than you are. So many of my Third World colleagues today, while appreciating the path-breaking work of Anand and Elias and the first generation of Third World intellectuals, reject that approach. They reject that approach because they think international law is part of the problem. We have no reason to be proud if our institutions seem to resemble European institutions. They would say. And so, this is the question I am posing in this lecture. Is it possible to write international law in a non-Eurocentric fashion? A colleague of mine, Chakrabarti, in his wonderful book, Provincializing Europe, tells his own struggle of attempting to write in India histories that would not be Eurocentric. Eurocentric in the sense that they would not follow the very standards of historiography that are Eurocentric. So Dipesh Chakrabarti's problem is that even if you want to focus on places where Europeans were not, or where Europeans were unimportant, the standards of historiography, the professional standards of writing, are European standards. So it is as if Europe, in this understanding, were spider's web. So you can't get rid of it. So whatever you do, you write a wonderful story of Chinese Empire, and the vocabulary that you use is a European vocabulary. You speak about sovereignty, jurisdiction, you speak about immunity, you speak about contract, etc. Is it possible to not to be Eurocentric? And I will finish this lecture by laying out 4 strategies that colleagues have used, friends with whom I collaborate now or have collaborated in the recent past, to try to struggle away from this damn spider's web. The first strategy is to focus on the colonial encounter itself. I put here yet another European face, this time still very much alive, Jörg Fisch. Jörg Fisch, who has written the first book on international law and European colonial expansion. Die Expansion der Europa und das Völkerrecht. The expansion of Europe and international law by Jörg Fisch, published in 1986. Nobody knows about it because it's not been translated into English. And therefore I make always this point that Danny, take his book, buy it through Amazon. It's not that expensive. And you can find out that there has been an interest in trying to write in a fashion that takes up Europe's imperial desires and puts international law into the picture of European imperialism. But that's not, of course, all. So the first strategy is the old strategy of shocking the reader and focusing very closely on the colonial encounter itself. Here, 2 familiar encounters. Here is Cortes, Pizarro, either one or the other, either in Mexico, in Peru, slaughtering the Indians. The stories are horrific. The Protestants knew it when they told the stories of the Legenda Negra. But those are not the only stories, of course. Here are Abyssinian soldiers waiting for the Italians who will use chemical weapons against them a few moments after this picture has been taken. Both Cortes and Mussolini had the best international legal minds on their side when they were carrying out their actions. Of course, international law was always, as it is always, on both sides. Every tyrant has an international lawyer by her side, saying to the tyrant, well, if you want to get rid of this population, you should do it like this. And on the other side also, there are the international lawyers. People ask me, well, Marti, what do you think of international? Wouldn't it be great if international law ruled us? I'm tired of that question. International law is just lawyers advising clients. And the clients are sometimes good, sometimes bad. And international lawyers choose their clients very well on the basis of how they can afford to live. They are paying the salaries, and well, this is what lawyers do. So there's no international law independent of what it is that international lawyers do or say. So focus on the encounter. Tell the damn story about and shock the reader into an anti-colonial consciousness, into a consciousness about the problem of Eurocentrism, of European expansion, problem of empire. First strategy. Second strategy, point to the colonial origins of familiar European legal concepts. So here is Francisco de Vitoria, a Dominican cleric who lived in Salamanca in Spain at the time of Charles V and the Spanish expansion in the Indies, but also expansion elsewhere. In his Relectiones Theologicae in his theological annual lectures, as well as in his lectures to his students in Salamanca. He developed a vocabulary, I already mentioned the word, a vocabulary of dominion that he took from, in part, Thomas Aquinas, in part from Roman law. And he applied that vocabulary especially to the expansion in the Indies. The Spanish Dominicans were in a tight spot when the Spaniards came to the Indies. They were called upon to justify what for many of them, including for Vitoria, had no justification. But they were good lawyers, so they were asked to give a justification. Here it is. And they used the vocabulary of dominium. Dominium jurisdictionis, dominium proprietatis, jurisdiction and property. The point is that these vocabularies, so familiar for us, and so intuitively we feel they are European vocabularies. Yes, but they are vocabularies created, limited, and determined through the colonial encounter. Tony Andy, a friend, now a professor of international law in Utah, wrote this wonderful book, International Law, Sovereignty, Imperialism and International Law, 2003, in which he in detail shows how crucial international law notions such as jurisdiction and property were developed and delimited by the Europeans in the context of the colonial encounter. So they are not indigenous European vocabularies. They are contextual vocabularies that Europeans seized in a specific historical moment. Third strategy, hybridization. So here is Time magazine and the picture of the rebel leader Abdel Karim during the War of the Rif. Here is Nathaniel Berman, a friend and a colleague who published recently a book in French and in English called French Passion et Ambivalence, Passion, Ambivalence and International Law, in which he tells the story of Abdel Karim. So this third world leader, third world intellectual who had been educated everywhere where intellectuals were educated in the early 20th century. He became an African rebel leader, but he was also a suave talker. And through his diplomacy in the League of Nations, he was able to convert many of the European political leaders on the side of the rebels, using international legal concepts popular in the League of Nations, such as, above all, self-determination, something not unknown in this context. I understand. So, self-determination, and Nathaniel Berman tells the story of how self-determination can be used as a hybrid, not just a European concept, but as a concept to be used against Europe. Two other colleagues, Arnulf Becker-Lorca and Liliana Obregón, both of them Latin Americans, both of them with a book in press. Arnulf's book should be out in a month or so. Arnulf tells the story of what he calls semi-peripheral international lawyers. International lawyers from Mexico, but from Latin America in general, from Japan, from Turkey, from China, from Russia, from Greece, who have used international law against the Europeans and have molded international law in a specific Turkish, Latin American fashion. The famous Calvo Doctrine, Drago Doctrine, Estrada Doctrine, these legal doctrines developed by Latin American self-determination people in order to struggle against the empire. Concepts reappropriated and hybridized. The third strategy. And the fourth strategy, I already mentioned Dipesh Chakravarty's suggestion, provincializing Europe. So take Europe away from its central role. Europe, I started this lecture by pointing to the silly European prejudice that Europe is the universe. that histoire de droit des gens is histoire universelle. Europeans are always like that. We always believe that our mind is somehow grasps the universal, and that everybody else, when they develop and progress, become like we are, because we aren't really weak. We are universal already. And so there are some, such as what I tried to do at the beginning of this lecture myself, who try to drag international law down from the terrible conceptual abstractions and say, well, no, it started on the 8th of September 1873 after lunch. It's a group of men having a conversation, bourgeois men in Brussels. It's not some vocabulary or an intellectual set of tools that governs the world. It's a very specific language spoken by a very limited group of professionals sitting perhaps somewhere between 47th and 52nd Street on First Avenue, where there is this tall building which was flooded not so long ago. It's those people who speak those languages at that time. So provincialization. Here are 4 strategies. I'm not suggesting to you that this is exhaustive of way of dealing with Eurocentrism. I'm trying to suggest to you that Eurocentrism is a big problem. That we can't just imagine ourselves one morning as revolutionary and anti-Europeans and think that that's all there is to it. We are completely in a world where European technologies, European professional vocabularies, European imaginations limit what it is that we can achieve. And we have to communicate with other people. We can't all of a sudden invent new professional tools or languages. But that there may be ways in which we don't get caught into those languages, like in the spider's web, you remember, that we can ironically reappropriate those languages in, for example, the 4 ways that I suggested. Thank you.
Mr. Koskenniemi, I have one question for you. Raymond Allen, in one of his books, said that international law has its origin in transnational society. What do you think about that sentence?
Has its origin in transnational society?
Yes, that said Raymond Allen in his book War and Peace Between Nations.
So, because international law is such a fluid stuff, there have always been ambitious men. Raymond Aron was an ambitious man. And these ambitious men have tried to grasp the essence of international law by giving it some new definition, some new conceptualization. And that's a part of academic struggles for power. Had Aron been very successful, then everybody would have started to say international law is based on transnational society or transactional society, and very rapidly, to be very hip, you would have to say that, which would mean that Raymond Aron would have become the super authority in international law. He would have been the native language speaker of the new language that he put forward. Now, this is slightly a provincialization answer, I realize. I think that Aron belonged to that group of mid-century intellectuals who were very disappointed with diplomacy and old kind of international law as they saw it. He didn't trust international institutions such as the League of Nations. Indeed, there was very little reason to trust him. He didn't have confidence in public diplomacy in other ways. But he might have had some sort of a faith in a transnational society, in humankind being linked together in some international community kind of a thing at some more he would think more fundamental sociological level that would be independent of the difficulties that these various specific institutions had. Many other people were saying this kind of thing as well. So Hersch Lauterpachter, whom I've written, an intellectual with a background not unlike Aron's, would have thought in the same way. Many people thought that the world is somehow united in a sociological sense already. We are already living in a... So interdependence is a vocabulary that was invented in the middle of the 19th century, and which people who despair about the present moment and think, well, we are not going to collapse in 5 minutes. But after all, we are all interdependent. And it's the same kind of argument that the rising tide raises all boats, you know. Some get rich, everybody gets rich, that kind of thing.